The temperature differential can exceed 40 degrees. Inside a well-built improvised shelter on Skid Row, a man sleeps comfortably at 68 degrees, while outside temperatures hover near freezing. 6 months later, that same shelter stays under 80 degrees when the pavement radiates over 115 degrees. The builders of these shelters never read about R values or thermal mass. They learn through necessity what happens when you trap air between barriers. Their techniques have spread through homeless communities across the country, and the principles work for anyone facing extreme temperatures without conventional resources. Marcus Thompson spent 17 years on the streets of Los Angeles before anyone asked how his shelter stayed so comfortable. Social workers noticed it first. During welfare checks on extreme weather days, his encampment showed something unusual. The standard blue tarps covering most shelters radiated heat in summer and provided almost no protection in winter. But Marcus and several other long-term residents had developed structures that maintained remarkably stable interior temperatures year-round. The technique wasn't magic, it was physics, learned through trial and error over years of observation. The problem Marcus solved was fundamental and brutal. Standard homeless shelters fail in both directions. In winter, single-layer construction allows body heat to escape almost as fast as it is generated. The cold pavement beneath acts like a massive heat sink, pulling warmth away through direct contact. Wind finds every gap in cardboard walls. By 3 in the morning, even multiple blankets cannot compensate for heat loss through conduction, convection, and radiation. People die from this every year, more than most cities acknowledge. But summer presents an equally dangerous challenge that gets less attention. A single-layer tarp or cardboard structure in direct sunlight becomes an oven. The material absorbs solar radiation and re-emits it as heat into the enclosed space. With no ventilation path for hot air or air to escape and for cooler air to enter, temperatures inside can exceed ambient by 20 or 30 degrees. Heat illness progresses rapidly in these conditions. Confusion, dizziness, and loss of consciousness can occur within hours. Between 1999 and 2016, extreme heat killed more people in the United States than floods, tornadoes, and hurricanes combined. Homeless populations bore a disproportionate impact. Marcus noticed that certain older men in his encampment never seemed to suffer these extremes. They had been on the streets for decades, some since the early 1980s, when deinstitutionalization and housing cuts created the modern homeless crisis. These men had developed solutions through pure necessity. They did not explain their techniques to newcomers immediately. Trust had to be earned. But Marcus was patient, and eventually, a man named Robert Williams showed him what made the difference. Robert had served in the Army during Vietnam and spent time stationed in Germany during winters that reached well below zero. Army training taught him basic principles of insulation and shelter construction. When he ended up homeless in Los Angeles in 1987, he applied those principles to his street survival. Over the following years, he refined his techniques based on what materials were actually available in urban environments. The key insight was simple but powerful. Still air is an excellent insulator. Section 1 of 3. The principle Robert taught Marcus drew on the same physics that makes double-pane windows work. Glass itself conducts heat fairly well. A single pane loses warmth rapidly in winter and gains it quickly in summer. But trap a layer of air between 2 panes, and heat transfer slows dramatically. Air conducts heat poorly when it cannot move, when convection currents are prevented by the narrow gap. The air becomes a barrier rather than a medium for heat loss. Robert realized this principle could transform how he built shelters using freely available materials. The construction method began with understanding what materials were actually accessible. Behind furniture stores, Robert found large cardboard sheets from shipping containers. Appliance delivery produced excellent boxes with relatively thick corrugated construction. Hardware stores discarded damaged rolls of plastic sheeting. Grocery stores threw away pallets that could be disassembled for wood. The key was combining these materials in specific ways, creating not one barrier against temperature, but multiple barriers with air gaps between them. This layered approach changed everything. Robert's basic winter shelter started with elevation. Direct contact with cold concrete or frozen ground created massive heat loss through conduction. A pallet base raised the sleeping surface 6 inches above the ground, and that air gap alone reduced heat loss significantly. But the real innovation came in the walls. He built what amounted to a shelter within a shelter, an inner chamber of cardboard surrounded by an outer shell of plastic sheeting with a deliberate air gap maintained between them. The trapped air became insulation. The outer shell served multiple functions. Heavy-duty plastic sheeting blocked wind completely, preventing the convective heat loss that made single-layer cardboard shelters so cold. It also provided waterproofing, critical for maintaining insulation value, since wet materials conduct heat much faster than dry ones. But Robert never sealed the outer layer directly to the inner cardboard structure. He used small spacers, pieces of foam or rolled cardboard, to maintain a gap of roughly 2 inches around the entire perimeter. That air gap made the difference between adequate shelter and genuine thermal protection. The inner chamber was where Robert slept, and he treated its construction with particular care. Multiple layers of cardboard lined the floor, ceiling, and walls, each layer adding to the overall R value, the measure of thermal resistance. He positioned the cardboard seams so they did not align between layers, blocking any straight path for air infiltration. The entrance was small, just large enough to crawl through, and he covered it with overlapping flaps that sealed when he settled inside. The goal was creating a space small enough that his body heat alone could maintain comfortable temperature. Marcus observed that Robert made seasonal adjustments to this basic design. In summer, the same principles applied but with different execution. The outer shell remained to block direct solar radiation, but Robert added ventilation paths that did not exist in the winter configuration. He created openings at the bottom of the structure where cooler ground level air could enter and slots near the top where hot air could escape. This simple convection system used natural thermodynamics. Hot air rises, exits through the top vents, and draws cooler air in through the bottom. The shelter breathed instead of trapping heat. The still air layer between the inner and outer shells acts as the insulator, slowing conduction and convection. Robert scavenged emergency blankets, the thin mylar sheets handed out by relief organizations, and positioned their reflective surface facing outward on his outer shell. Solar radiation that would otherwise be absorbed and re-emitted as heat was reflected away. Inside the shelter, temperatures stayed notably lower than in structures without this modification. The same mylar layer helped in winter by reflecting body heat back inward, reducing radiant heat loss. One material served dual seasonal functions depending on its orientation. Section 2 of 3. The knowledge Robert developed did not stay with him alone. Homeless encampments function as communities with their own social structures and information networks. Men who had been on the streets the longest held practical knowledge worth more than formal education in survival situations. Younger or newer residents learned from observing those who managed to stay healthier through extreme weather. Robert taught several people over the years, and each adapted his techniques to their own circumstances and available materials. Marcus became one of the most accomplished practitioners. Marcus refined the approach further by paying attention to thermal mass. He noticed that certain materials inside a shelter helped moderate temperature swings, even beyond the insulation value of the walls. Water bottles filled from public fountains and placed along the interior walls absorbed excess heat during warm periods and released it when temperatures dropped. The water's high specific heat capacity made it an effective thermal battery. During winter days, when afternoon sun provided free warmth, the water absorbed that heat and released it slowly through the cold night hours. Marcus learned to position these water bottles where they would receive maximum solar gain through translucent sections of his shelter wall. The construction techniques spread through multiple encampments during the 1990s and the 2000s. Outreach workers began noticing the difference in certain shelters during extreme weather checks. The men who built them reported fewer health problems related to temperature exposure. During a 2006 heat wave that killed over 140 people in California, some encampments with these improved shelters reported no heat-related medical emergencies despite lacking any air conditioning. The techniques were literally saving lives, yet they remained largely undocumented in any formal way. Several factors explained why this practical knowledge did not reach mainstream awareness. The men who developed these techniques were largely invisible to the broader society that might have benefited from their insights. Academic researchers studying homelessness focused on social causes and policy solutions rather than material adaptations to street life. The men themselves had little incentive to publicize their methods, which provided competitive advantage in harsh environments where resource scarcity was constant. Knowledge remained within networks of trust built through years of shared hardship. The technical principles at work in these shelters align precisely with formal building science. Professional insulation works by trapping air in fibrous or foam matrices that prevent convective circulation. The cardboard and plastic layering system achieves the same effect through cruder means. Double wall construction with air gaps appears in traditional buildings, from German half-timber houses to Japanese storehouse design. What Robert and Marcus discovered independently mirrors techniques developed across cultures and centuries wherever extreme temperatures challenged human survival. The material science also held up under examination. Corrugated cardboard has an R value between 3 and 4 per inch when dry, comparable to some commercial insulation products. Plastic sheeting provides minimal insulation itself, but creates the air barrier necessary for trapped air to function as an insulator. Mylar emergency blankets reflect up to 90% of radiant heat when properly positioned. Each component contributed specific thermal properties, and the system worked because it addressed all three modes of heat transfer simultaneously: conduction through elevated platforms, convection through sealed air gaps, and radiation through reflective surfaces. Marcus eventually documented his methods when a documentary filmmaker spent 3 months in his encampment during 2008. The resulting footage showed detailed construction techniques that had never been formally recorded. Social service agencies began distributing summaries to homeless outreach workers. Emergency preparedness organizations recognized applications beyond homeless survival. The same principles work for disaster response shelters, hunting camps, and emergency situations where conventional heating or cooling is unavailable. What began as survival necessity produced knowledge with broad practical value. Section 3 of 3. The broader implications of this knowledge extend well beyond homeless populations. Climate change is increasing the frequency of extreme weather events that strand people without access to conventional shelter. Power outages during heat waves and cold snaps regularly kill vulnerable populations who lack backup heating or cooling systems. The techniques developed on city streets offer genuinely useful alternatives for anyone facing temperature extremes with limited resources. A double-layer shelter built from materials available after most disasters can provide survivable conditions when nothing else is possible. The mathematical reality of the improvement matched what theory predicted. Temperature monitoring, conducted in Marcus's encampment during a 2010 research project, showed 25 to 35 degree differentials between well-built double-layer shelters and single-layer structures of similar size. During a winter night that dropped to 32 degrees outside, interior temperature in Marcus's shelter stabilized around 58 degrees with body heat alone. During a summer afternoon with ambient temperature reaching 102 degrees, his shelter interior measured 74 degrees, while adjacent single-layer shelters exceeded 115 degrees. The difference was literally life-saving. The legacy of this practical knowledge continues spreading through networks both formal and informal. YouTube videos now demonstrate construction techniques derived from what homeless innovators developed. Survival forums discuss double wall principles originally refined on Skid Row. Emergency management professionals increasingly reference these methods in disaster preparedness training. What began as invisible knowledge held by marginalized men has entered broader awareness, though rarely with proper attribution to its origins. The men who developed these techniques solved real problems through direct observation and experimentation over years. They deserve recognition as practical engineers. The deeper lesson involves how innovation actually happens when lives depend on it. Marcus and Robert and the other men who developed these techniques didn't have access to formal education, building codes, or professional resources. What they had was necessity, available materials, and the intelligence to observe what worked. They tested their designs through the most demanding conditions imaginable, living inside their experiments through extreme heat and cold. Failures weren't theoretical, but immediate and potentially fatal. This concentrated focus produced solutions that formal engineering might have achieved more elegantly, but not more effectively given the constraints. The cultural significance of this knowledge deserves acknowledgement beyond its practical applications. Black men in American cities have been among the most visible and vulnerable homeless populations for decades. The systemic factors creating this vulnerability, including housing discrimination, mass incarceration, and employment barriers, represent profound failures of policy and society. Yet within these failures, human ingenuity persisted. The men who developed superior shelter techniques demonstrated exactly the kind of problem-solving ability that formal systems often failed to recognize or develop. Their innovations emerged from circumstances no one would choose, yet the innovations themselves have genuine value. The practical wisdom embedded in these shelter techniques connects to a longer tradition of survival knowledge developed by marginalized communities throughout history. Enslaved people developed agricultural techniques that their enslavers adopted without acknowledgement. Migrant workers developed transportation and communication networks that sustained communities across generations. Knowledge developed under conditions of hardship often proves more robust and adaptable than solutions designed in comfortable circumstances. What homeless innovators discovered about thermal physics represents one more chapter in this tradition, practical wisdom earned through necessity and preserved through community transmission. The fundamental principles remain available to anyone facing extreme temperatures without conventional resources. Elevate your shelter above cold ground. Create multiple barriers with air gaps between them. Seal against wind infiltration in winter, and allow convective airflow in summer. Use reflective materials to manage radiant heat. Add thermal mass to moderate temperature swings. These simple principles, discovered through years of experimentation by men whose names rarely appeared in any record, can mean the difference between survival and serious harm. The knowledge they developed deserves both preservation and respect. Marcus Thompson died in 2019, still living on the streets where he had spent most of his adult life. But the techniques he refined and taught continued spreading through the communities he had served. Younger homeless men still build shelters using methods he demonstrated. Emergency response workers still reference principles he helped document. The knowledge lives on, serving exactly the purpose Marcus would have wanted, helping people survive conditions that would otherwise overwhelm them. Innovation does not always come from universities or research labs. Sometimes it comes from people paying attention to their immediate circumstances and refusing to accept unnecessary suffering.